The High Court in Pretoria has issued a landmark ruling intended to protect African penguins, which have declined sharply in numbers in recent years. The court has imposed 6 no-fishing zones around key breeding colonies, mostly in the Western Cape. Now, they'll be put in place within 2 weeks, preventing fishing boats from catching sardines and anchovies for the next 10 years in specific areas. The African penguin population declined by more than a third between 2018 and 2023. We've now roped in Kate Handley, Executive Director of the Biodiversity Law Centre. She's one of the attorneys representing Birdlife and SANCCOB in the litigation. Kate, a very good afternoon to you and thank you so much for your time. As we get your reaction to this ruling and on the legal precedents here, perhaps unpack what were the key legal arguments that led to this court ruling?
Thanks so much, Anati. And yes, it's a really great victory for us and for African penguin conservation in general. We had launched the case on behalf of Birdlife and SANCCOB last year in March in order to challenge a decision by the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment to impose no-take zones around these key breeding colonies. But unfortunately, no-take zones that were not biologically meaningful in the sense that they didn't incorporate the penguins' core foraging areas. We challenged the decision on the basis that it was irrational and unlawful because the minister, after having appointed an expert panel to review the science relating to island closures and to make a recommendation of the trade-off mechanism that needed to be applied to determine these closures, the minister then didn't make a decision that accorded with that trade-off mechanism. And this is important because the mechanism creates a balance between the costs to industry on the one hand and the benefits to African penguins on the other. So through much negotiation and debate, particularly with the small pelagic fishing industry, we actually managed to reach an agreement regarding island closures that are biologically meaningful for penguins, which is why this settlement agreement that was yesterday made in order of court is such a big success.
I would imagine it was made with the department. But my next question would then have there been any immediate challenges, maybe from the fishing industry, perhaps even community members? Could they appeal this ruling?
It's the settlement agreement, so it's not subject to legal appeal. But it's important to note that the closures that have been reached are a compromise in order to accommodate the needs of the fishing industry. And I have no doubt that in the course of negotiations, the two industry representatives or representative bodies that were party to the court proceedings engaged extensively with their members around the proposed closures. So it really is an outcome of considerable collaboration and accommodation between the parties. And as you say, endorsed by the department and the minister.
Yeah, endorsements aside and notwithstanding, should there be any infringement, are there any penalties that will be enforced for violators of this court ruling? And better yet, who will do the enforcement?
It's a very good question and one that I think bears consideration. And I think the first thing to note is that when these closures are implemented, it will be done in terms of the permits that the various rights holders have to fish sardine and anchovy. And this is done under the Marine Living Resources Act. So breaching these settlement agreements in relation to closures would attract penalties in terms of the Marine Living Resources Act. But in addition to that, they have now been made an order of court. So breaching these closures would actually attract contempt of court proceedings and a whole different suite of sanctions against the infringer. So there are serious consequences for not complying with the closures that have been now made in order of court.
Yeah, just on the environmental or even ecological, as it were, social, economic considerations that were applied here, from a bird life perspective, what were the key concerns here as it speaks to the African penguin, but also, more importantly, maybe any data that was also used during these court proceedings that you can share with us?
Well, there was extensive data that was used during the court proceedings. The arguments that we raised were supported by the science of our clients, Birdlife and SANCCOB, around where penguins actually prefer to forage. So that was a significant data contribution to the court case. But from Birdlife's perspectives, African penguins have faced a dramatic population decline, 97% in the last century, and were uplisted to critically endangered by the IUCN in October last year. So it really is dire straits for the species. And it's important from an ecological perspective because penguins are indicator species. So if penguin populations are declining, we need to be a lot more concerned about the state of our marine ecosystems, and particularly the small pelagic fish stocks on which they rely. And I mean, this is not just relevant from a conservation perspective, but if we're seeing declines in sardine and anchovy, this is also significant for the fishing sectors that rely on these forage fish, like snook and geelback, that actually eat these forage fish. So the implications are not just related to penguins. It really does boil down to the sardine and anchovy stock and the general state of our marine ecosystem.
And that was exactly going to be my last question in terms of just from a future legal development perspective. I mean, does this ruling set a legal precedent, as it were, for protecting even other endangered marine species, as you've just mentioned a few now?
Yeah, no, I mean, from a lawyer's perspective, the one disadvantage of reaching a settlement is that you don't create legal precedent, in the sense that we don't have a reportable judgment, and it doesn't rule conclusively on principles of law. But that being said, the case was really one of the first of its kind in South Africa to call on the minister's statutory and constitutional duties to prevent a threatened species from going extinct. So I certainly hope that the arguments that we have been making in this case are taken up by other conservation organizations looking to protect threatened species, and really that the act of actually using the law as a tool to address threatened species population decline is something that other conservation organizations will consider.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. A fascinating case indeed. That was Kate Handley, Executive Director of the Biodiversity Law Centre, one of the attorneys representing Birdlife and SANCCOB in this particular litigation. Of course, an interesting court case there. The High Court in Pretoria issuing this landmark ruling intended to protect African penguins.